Hello YouTubers, Joshua724 here. If you haven't found out by now, I am a die-hard Star Wars fan. My interest in the movies started out at an early age. I was enthralled by the action in the story. I enjoyed it every time it came on TV or I played my VHS tape. Of course, this is all due to what my dad's job was at the time. We were living in Michigan in 1983. I wasn't conceived until later the year. However, there was an article in the newspaper by a small company that would end up becoming very important. They were the first home video distribution company in the United States, if not the world, to have surround sound encoding hardware and a THX certified movie transfer system. What's more, the man in charge of supervising movie transfers became one of the few individuals there to become THX certified by a THX certified technician. That company was CBS-FOX Video, and an individual hired by them to supervise their film transfers was my dad, Wayne Cook. Now, you had a basic background in photography before you worked at CBS-FOX?
Yeah, I had my first picture published when I was 11 years old. I took a picture of a Helio STOL, which is a short takeoff and landing, in its maiden flight over an airport, a country airport in North Carolina. And it was the only picture of the airplane outside of the factory. And when my dad saw the picture, he got really excited and said he wanted to help get it published. Well, he didn't tell me that right out. He just helped me get the film developed and so forth. And when he took it over to the magazine office, which was also in that same little village we were in, they put it in the magazine and sent it around the world. So my first publish was also in an international publication. And I was just, by then, so sucked into this art form that I kept taking pictures no matter whether I had a little Kodak Brownie, which was already, I believe, 60 years old when I got it, and it still works. It's in a box out in our garage. And went on through an Argus C3 and other cameras and started working with slide film and movie film and trying all kinds of different emulsions and speeds and stuff, trying to find the best combination for each situation and subject. And as I did that, then of course I was getting exposed, quote unquote, to film emulsions and situations and kinds of work. And by the time I got to 20th Century Fox, I'd already had several modeling portfolios I did for people, and lots of industrial photography that I'd done for several clients. So when I walked in there, I was really familiar with the same kinds of film they were using to shoot Star Wars with. And when I told them the photography background, they didn't care about anything else I did technically, just that I had a film background, and I was immediately hired. They didn't even bother interviewing anybody else. So I got the job basically because of my photographic background, not because I was such a great television engineer at that point.
The newspaper article that had been put out as a call for engineers, you want to describe?
Well, it wasn't an article. It was an ad in the classified section of the Detroit Morning News. I believe that was the name of the paper. And no, Detroit Free Press. And your mother saw it while I was at the computer shop one day, and when I got home from work, she was excited, but she was trying to contain herself because she wasn't sure what I was looking for. She just saw CBS and Fox and this logo in the ad and the little bits of copy underneath that said they were looking for engineers. Well, I looked at the ad and I got excited, and I thought, okay, I'll make a resume and just pray that they look at it and see the potential, because the background that I had was as a television cameraman and as a still photographer. So making that transition, I thought, boy, this is going to be hard. So we looked at the ad, and being Christians as we are, she and I then got down on our knees and prayed, Lord, if this is it, open the door, because this sounds so exciting. And we went down to the Farmington Hills, Michigan studio, and the rest is history.
Yeah, the company that made the call-out was originally the first company to distribute movies on home video format. The company was called Magnetic Video and was founded in 1968 by Andre Blay and started distributing videos in 1977. There was another company called Cartridge Television, founded in 1972, who preceded Magnetic Video in terms of public distribution. But the videos were for rental, the players were big and bulky as compared with VCRs, and the company didn't last long. Blay convinced 20th Century Fox in 1977 to license 50 of their films for distribution onto VHS and Betamax formats. The process became so successful that Fox purchased Magnetic Video in 1979 and reorganized it into 20th Century Fox Video in 1982. Later, in 1982, Fox merged its video operations with CBS and formed CBS-FOX Video. It was at this point that the call was made in 1983 for engineers to be involved in the distribution of a very important movie. So,
yeah, that's interesting, because about the time that I saw the article in Newsweek was just maybe a year and a half after I had taken your older sister to see the Star Wars film in a real small town in Michigan. And I kept thinking, wow, it would be so much fun to work on this series. Who would have guessed that a year and a half later I was going to be working for 20th Century Fox? That just blew us away.
So basically, they were so impressed that they eventually sent you to New York to...
Yeah, they sent me to Nyack, New York for 2 weeks to work on the Rank Centel. It was the biggest television kind of machinery I had ever seen before. It weighed roughly 1,000 pounds, and the way the films were made, in fact, they still are in film form, and there are still companies that are shooting 35 millimeter. You get a 10-minute reel of negative, and it's loaded into a cartridge case, and with that 10 minutes, then you shoot a scene. And then when you change scenes, you change reels, because with all the takes and everything, you are likely to use up that reel of film. So a typical movie, say it's an hour and a half to 2 hours, is going to take at least 20 of those reels of film, plus if it's in surround, then there's a whole nother set of films that have oxide coated on them that equal all of the films you shot for the movie. Now, you don't shoot them all at the same time. There's a guy there that's recording the sound, and he's putting it on a digital recorder. You're shooting the film, he's shooting the audio on a different machine. It doesn't get to film until you get to a lab, and then they transfer his stuff then. It doesn't happen at a studio like CBS-FOX where I work. That is where we take the internegative film, which is the distribution master from the camera negatives, which are physically spliced together, and this is just one straight piece of film, along with the audio mag follower, which is up to 6 tracks of audio, and then we put those on 1-inch masters, scene by scene. But the actual movie itself being shot on 10 minutes, because when you think about it, if a company was going to shoot a 2-hour film, they would not put a 2-hour reel of film in a camera. Nobody could pick it up. And, so they shoot smaller segments of it and then splice it together.
Plus, we're also including the time it takes to load the film in, time it takes to rewind the film and pull it off and put the next reel on.
Right, and the way that they used to deliver it to the theaters was the same way. They'd deliver a pallet of reels, and then the projectionist would have to put them in order and then stack them on opposite projections, or projection equipment, and then he'd alternate back and forth, loading the films until the film was done, because there was, a 10-minute reel, and then that telltale circle at the end of the first reel, and he'd start the second one, and so on.
Now, with this being a new type of way to transfer film, I imagine that there was a huge learning curve in terms of trying to figure out how.
Oh, yeah. When they first started doing film transfer, they did it from a projection, like a home projector, only this was 35 millimeter, and then they'd shoot with a television camera against a mirror, so they'd have to make sure, of course, that they'd flip the image around. So here's the projector on one side with these 35 millimeter reels, and then the camera over there. And these are not light cameras either. These are the same studio cameras that they were using to shoot everything else. And they would transfer. They didn't do any correction. It wasn't until Ranks Intel came out with film transfer machines in the 60s that any scene correction was done at all. They did what they called it one light, which was basically a single pass of the movie through the projector and record it all through the camera and then distribute it however it was.
You were going into a little about what the machine was like to use to do this transfer?
When I went there, they told us that this was unlike any camera that we'd ever worked with. Basically, that had a small circular CRT, a lot like the first televisions that were made, only this one was projecting nothing but light through it, and then going through that frame of film that was in the gate, and then onto a sensor. So it wasn't sending out precise lines like you see on a television screen. It was sending out a flow of light, and it would scan back and forth until it got to the end of that frame. Well, obviously, it had to be done really fast. You had, in those days, between 24 and 30 frames a second. So to get those 525 lines, it had to fly back and forth pretty quickly. Well, it wore the tube out, so roughly once a year, I'd have to replace the CRTs. The CRTs were roughly $3,500 a piece, and it would take me most of a day to pull the old one out and put the new one in. To operate it, everything that controlled that machine was on little stick-in cards in cages in the front of the machine, and I'd have to go through every morning and do basic alignments on that machine before they ever started, because it would sit overnight and it would drift. It would take me roughly an hour and a half every day to tweak that machine on a calibration frame, and then we'd check it in motion, because in motion the light level and the color would change slightly. The idea was to get everything lined up in that frame, in those card frames, so that the still matched the moving image. Then they could start.
The print that was normally given to do the transfer, you mentioned it was the O negative?
An internegative was the copy of the spliced together camera negatives. The camera negatives, I mean, you see film tables, editing tables on the internet all over the place. There's lots of pictures of them. What they would do is take the camera negatives and they would hang them up on the wall and number them and so forth, so that they would know where they were in the film. And as the editor and the producer or director or whoever happened to be in the room with him would look at these frames on basically a monitor that, light shining through the film onto, roughly a 12 by 12 monitor, they would see where they were in the film by looking at the frames, and then take the next piece down, physically splice it together with, clear tape with sprocket holes in it, cut the ends off, and then go on to the next one. When they got done, they had the film, on basically that 10 minutes, and then they'd have to take that 10 minutes and then copy that onto an Internet so that they'd have a film that didn't have the actual physical splices, because the splices aren't very strong. they will fall apart. So they wanted to, film that they were going to be able to copy over and over again without having to redo the splices once a week. Because most films will have between 250 and 500 copies made as they're distributed around the country, and obviously more than that when they're done in other languages to go to different countries.
Was it easier to do these transfers in widescreen or pan and scan?
It was better. It was easier to do them in letterbox, especially widescreen. The Star Wars films were shot in 2.35 to 1, which isn't the widest format, but it's at least a pleasing format. And the whole psychology behind doing films like that was based upon the way that we see. We don't look at our world vertically without tilting our heads. We look at our world horizontally, and we pan our heads to look at basically what amounts to a panoramic vision. Now, the world that we see obviously is much bigger, but when the camera looks at it, it sees so many degrees, and if you want to see up or down, you normally tilt. When you see side to side, your eyes actually perceive more side to side, and that's the way our world is. We don't climb up and down to do most of our chores. We walk, whether it's to the kitchen or the front door, our motion is horizontal, and so that's the way the world is portrayed in most movies. Whether it's IMAX or even a TV screen is a little slightly wider, 4x3 than it is tall, and so the whole philosophy of making movies was that this is a horizontal world.
Was there a deciding factor as to whether or not you would use letterbox or pan and scan?
Pan and scan was done for most films up until Star Wars, and George wanted to see what it would look like in letterbox and in pan and scan, because of the way that actors were positioned in the sets. They were far enough apart that you couldn't get them in a normal 4x3 screen. So he wanted to see what it would look like in letterbox, since in letterbox and NTSC then was roughly a third less resolution, because there's these black patches at the top and the bottom of each frame, in this wide screen. Well, if you had like a 12-inch screen, you were looking at a pretty small picture. And if you're, watching it on that, like the typical home TV back then wasn't very big. So for the usual home market, the pan and scan was done, but then how do you get the actors? Do you shoot this one and then shoot that one? The letterbox was basically the way to get around that issue, because they were so far apart that the pan and scan would not get both people in the frame.
There are some movies that they had, it was either letterbox or squishing done if it was a pan and scan. Like, for example, the Death Set had the opening and ending titles squished.
Yeah, we talked about that when we did them, and basically the guy who was doing the color correction decided he was going to do a squish to get that information in, because it didn't make sense for us to go back and forth. But a pan and scan, just squish it down, get it in, get through it, and then switch to letterbox or pan and scan and shoot, transfer the rest of the movie scenes that way. We didn't switch back and forth because it would obviously be confusing. So it was either, the credits and titles and so forth would be done in squish, basically a zoom mode, or the movie done in letterbox. And I preferred the letterbox because you could see everything that was going on. To me, the ultimate content of the movie was more important to me than seeing close-ups of the actors and actresses like you would in a pan and scan.
And the beginning of Star Wars, that had big enough letters that
Yep.
they could get away with pan and scan for the beginning, and the credits would have probably been on their own reel, which would have been easy to like squish that. As
That's
the last
always
thing.
done, yeah.
If there was something wrong with the print you were given, did you have to do anything extra to make it usable?
On when we got that film, that entire series, they were in good shape. We didn't have to do. I think we had to put one splice on the Interneg. Now, the Interneg is actually another film stock. I looked it up a few months ago, and there's a codec site that talks about Internegs and the typical film stock for it, and I forget what the number is. It's a 4-digit number that they use. But we put one splice on that because the Interneg that we did get had been used so much that it actually broke once. So we had to splice it, and so we were really careful with it. We didn't very often do, like a fast forward of a reel-to-reel tape because the rank was so strong that when you put the brakes on, because it wanted to stop at a frame, and you could dial in the frame, it would stop so hard, so fast, that you'd take a big chance on breaking any film on it.
Because each film was probably filmed in a unique way, did the machines have to get readjusted to compensate for the variations in filming methods?
Yep, every single film has its own little characteristics, chemical psychology, whatever term you want to use for it. Every single film that you get in a transfer suite is slightly different from the one you just did or the one after it. Another example, an extreme example, is Yentl, which came to mind as soon as you asked me that question, because that particular film, Barbra Streisand had shot it with a yellow cast to indicate that it was a period piece, and we put it on the rank and looked at the first frames of the video, or first frames of the film, it didn't look right. It had that yellow cast, and we went through, had done the typical setups, basically zeroing everything out. And when we did that, there was this yellowish looking, it was almost mustard looking film over the film. Well, she had done that on purpose. And our studio wrote a letter at my request to her, and she replied back when she was pretty upset. But let's see, Robert Altman had shot a film about Buffalo Bill that had a color cast to it. Every film, even the black and white films, come through the film transfer, and they're slightly different colors depending on age. So even those films have to be handled and calibrated before you actually do the transfer every single time. And that can take up to a half a day, because not only do you have to calibrate the transfer machine for the film, but you have to look through the entire film and find out, are my calibrations going to last me all the way through this film, or is there some scene in this that's going to be so extreme that I've got to adjust the window of acceptability to that scene and then hope the rest of the movie fits into it, because it happens.
Anything that you had to do extra for like subtitles for foreign languages or even movies that had alien languages?
No, all of that was done. All of the subtitle graphics and so forth for the languages that they used in the film was all there. Anything that was going to be added, basically what we were making was a master, and then those masters would go by tape to whatever studio was going to add the graphics. Once in a while, we would do the subtitling on a film, but we had edit suites. We didn't do any of that in the film suite. That would go into an edit suite, and they would, with a character generator, add those subtitles in.
Considering that older films used nitrate, was there ever any danger or special consideration needed to be taken to transfer the film safely?
Wow. Nitrates were terrible. Basically what, and you can look this up on Wiki, nitrate is just a film stock that is it was pretty much available back in the early days, but it was so unstable that after it had set for a while, it would become really flammable. In fact, it was flammable, period. But it became extremely unstable, and so we had to have a fire extinguisher sitting in front of the rank and me sitting in a chair next to it in case something happened. Even running the film back and forth could cause static to build up, and then it would self-ignite. The one that I remember the best was a bunch of films that we got from Charlie Chaplin's widow that had been stored in their basement, and well after he died, she was living in the house, and somebody found out that there were a whole bunch of films in the basement that had never been shown. And so Fox offered her a lot of money, and basically we bought the entire stock, and they got shipped to us. And, you know, outside of the natural excitement, because we were the first people that had, some of these had never been released, so we were the first people outside of the actual film editors in Hollywood who had ever seen these films. And it never made it out to the public. For whatever reason, they'd never been released. So, knowing, and I remember opening up one of the film cans and handling the leader, and it disintegrated my fingers. And basically I said, okay, we've got a real problem here. If these films are this bad, do we send them out to another lab to have the actual the nitrate strengthened? What do we do? And the guys, the senior guy that was there had handled nitrates before, and he said, well, let's hope that down inside the film that they're protected a little bit better. And it turned out that they were. That was just that one reel, and the first 6 inches or so of it that I had touched, it just basically turned to dust in my hands. Well, the rest of them were okay, and so we were able to do them. And we never had any fire problem. We were just really careful to keep the humidity and temperature in that film room constant so it would minimize the danger. But that took us about a month and a half, 2 months maybe, to go through those Chaplin films, and every day was a interesting, sometimes a nail biter.
Now, you mentioned a number of high-profile films: Barbra Streisand's Yentl, Buffalo Bill, a bunch of Charlie Chaplin films that have recently been discovered back then. Any other high-profile films you remember?
Yankee Doodle Dandy was the first film that I remember we did a coloring job, and that was something that Fox wanted to release in color, and it didn't exist in color. So they sent it out to a guy, I think on the West Coast, who specialized in coloring films, and he colored that. When we got it back and Fox started promoting it as colorization of Yankee Doodle Dandy, there was such an uproar. Some people wanted it, some people hated it, some people were willing to go to court to stop Fox from doing it. It was ridiculous because it wasn't much later that TNT decided they were going to buy up an entire library of black and whites and color them all. And I don't remember them, people complained about it, but it was like TNT just basically thumbed their noses at, this elite, film file public and colored them anyway, and they were a huge success. It made, TNT a lot of money. The other thing that was done with that film besides coloring was that the guy did a digital restoration, because the film was pretty dirty, and of both the video and the audio. I saw the film before and after the process was done, and before it was done, it was almost unviewable, and it sounded like a 78 record when you played the sound back, really scratchy sounding. And when we got it back from the guy, it was like, this is a brand new film. It was very clean looking. There was once in a while there was a spot on it, and a really bad scratch you could hear, but it was what he had done was almost like magic because it sounded and looked so good. We didn't have a whole lot of those. That one was both a test and a commercial experiment, and it turned out to work really well and kind of paved the way for more digital restorations. I'm not sure it was the first, but if it wasn't, it was like in the first 10 films at least in the country that were black and white and they wanted restored and colorized.
Another film in particular that is rather popular he did was the Alien series. You want to briefly talk about that?
When we got those films in, I had never seen them. I just heard about them, and I was curious to see what they had done and how they had portrayed this thing. And when I finally sat down in the film suite with the guys who were transferring it and doing the scene correction, I was kind of in shock at this, the Sigourney character going up against this thing, because it seemed like it not only was just really nasty with huge fangs, but all powerful. And if I remember correctly, the film transfer guy and myself, and I was supervising this process, we both had nightmares while we were doing the film. And I left after the first day, didn't go back in the film suite, and it's like, okay, I'm done with this. I'll work on the machine, but I am not watching any more frames of that thing snapping its jaws at her. It was awful.
And of course, this is rather ironic due to the fact that I own Alien Anthology on Blu-ray myself. Was anyone from the original film production involved so as to give their input about how they thought the movie should look as a final result, or like any representatives from those studios or the individuals?
In most cases, when we did a film, we had to contact the director. The director kind of controlled how the film looked when it was distributed, because he wanted, each director had the control over how the film was projected in the theaters, and according to his contracts or her contracts, the same thing was going to happen in distribution to tape, Laserdisc, or whatever format it went out on. And so the extreme was Barbra Streisand. Robert Altman, he didn't really. We always sent rushes out to the directors. Every day's work was copied onto 2 VHSs and 2 betas, and we'd send one set to them for them to look at. Either not that night, because it didn't get there till the next morning. They'd look at them the next morning, and they would call the studio and make suggestions. And then, as we got into the film, the suggestions become less and less because they were seeing, continuity and so forth. But every director definitely had their idea how the film should look. The only company that actually sent somebody was Lucasfilm, and they sent an engineer because this was the first digital transfer of video and audio that had been done in film history. And nobody knew how it was going to turn out, and nobody really was sure how to start. We had prototypes from both Shure Audio and from Dolby, neither company of which knew that their own skunk works had designed and built these prototypes for us. So when I called to get help about hooking them up, nobody knew what I was talking about. And I'd explained what was going on, and whoever I happened to be talking with, customer service or whatever, the people who were supposed to have access to documentation didn't have documentation. It hadn't been written yet. So I kind of had to go by guess and by golly setting up both of these boxes. And then when the THX chief engineer, Bob Schneider from Lucasfilm, came to the studio. It was just a few days after he wanted to know, okay, when you get this all wired up, let me know and I will fly over. And he spent a week with me, and we went through every single audio step from the film transfer suite to the encoders to the videotape to make sure that all the levels were correct so that there was enough dynamic range in that sampling structure so that when there was quiet in the film, it was going to be dead quiet on tape. And when there was a lot going on, and it was, there was rumbles and screams and whatnot, that there was enough headroom that we weren't going to hit the brick wall and go into distortion. And he spent 4 of the 5 days that he was there tweaking, endlessly tweaking. And at the same time, he was teaching me what he had done in the THX certified theaters, because he was the guy who had done all of those too. So I got THX certified, basically the first engineer in the country that, and this is still 1983, and they're still installing these in theaters around the country. So he was the only guy in the 4 years that I was there that ever came from any of the companies to actually put eyes on a film and say, this is what we're going to do.
And now we come to what might be considered the most important part, Star Wars. Now, before I begin, one particular note I mentioned briefly about the theatrical release of Star Wars via the audio track. The negative for Star Wars and the sequels did have accompanying 6-track audio tracks to go with them. Dolby had engineered in the early 70s Dolby stereo encoding technology. This enabled 6-track Dolby stereo sound to be distributed to movie theaters. Furthermore, it was Star Wars that got everyone to take notice of this new sound technology. So, what was it like to work on Star Wars?
Well, because we were at the beginning of this new technology, surround from two tracks of audio, and everything was built out from that. Dolby had put considerable engineering efforts into figuring out how that was going to get done, and they had been in meetings with the Audio Engineering Society, and they had come up with a standard of how they were going to make this work, and they had actually built a formula on the whole technology about how the stuff was going to get recorded, and they had built this prototype around that. Well, setting that up meant that that formula had to be followed very closely, which was basically, the components of left and right subtracted from each other and added to each other, and every one of those steps of math was sent to a different track. So the center track was left plus right, and subtracting all of the extra elements, everything that showed up in stereo, was also subtracted from that, so the only thing you got in the center was what they wanted in the center, and most of the time that was voices. Once in a while, it was, lightsaber crashes and that sort of thing that would show up in the center of the picture. So the surround was separated out by steering those sounds away from the center of the film and then subtracting the voice so it wouldn't show up in any of the other tracks, and then sending those with a delay, and it was a minimum of 12 milliseconds, and they'd send that to the rear speakers. Well, setting up that decoder in the film suite meant that that delay had to be custom adjusted for the room it was in so that it wasn't too short and it wasn't too long. Because if it was too long, then you'd start getting echoes and splashes off the side walls, and it would get confusing. And we still do that. Every time you set up a surround system in a theater in somebody's home, you do exactly the same process, and that's why you have a technician come in and set up most surround systems in homes, is because that delay has to be set for that room.
Now, for those of you who may not realize some extra tidbits about your CBS-FOX videotapes, Episode 5 and 6 were both mixed in surround sound, but Episode 4's first run, which was on CED, had a stereo release. Now, all 3 movies were given to CBS-FOX with their accompanying 6-track audio tracks. However, it was the time frame in which they were transferred to VHS that determined how their audio tracks would be handled. As such, Episode 4 would eventually get distributed with some major changes about to happen in the movie industry. Now, as far as Episode 4's print was, you mentioned that there was a first print that you had gotten before the proper print.
Yeah, the first time it went through, there was no supervision. The guy did it. I wasn't there. I got there and they talked about it, and somebody said that they were sending it back because George was so happy with the way that Episode 5 had turned out both visually and orally that they wanted Episode 4 redone in surround, since it had only been done in stereo, and then they were going to release that the way they had done Episode 5 and 6. So when it came back, he redid the video, and we already had the surround set up by then, so we processed it the same way. The thing that was probably most difficult in the entire audio process was it's actually started with that 6-track, because we found out that the machine that was playing back the 6-track would not stay in sync with the film. And it was just crazy, because we'd actually have to go out there and manually turn what they call the mag follower, which is that film with the oxides on it, turn it until they lined up again, and then start again. And you imagine every scene you're having to go out and manually turn those reels to get those sprockets between the count. So the count is exactly the same on both machines every single day, 8 hours a day. It gets really monotonous. Well, I looked at the sync signals coming off of the rank to that RCA mag follower, and I found out that the waveform that was going to keep it locked had a round corner, and that was causing the sprockets to slip. So I came up with a circuit to square the leading edge of that pulse, and that fixed the whole problem. It took me about 2 days of tinkering, but I figured out a circuit that would do it, and it fixed it. And who knows, they may be still using it today. It wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't like I invented anything. I just fixed a problem. But the entire digital process, the stuff that Bob Schneider had come to teach me and to help us get set up, was so difficult for the factory to get onto beta and VHS. We worked on just that digital process for about 3 months before actually got the whole thing working, because digital was so new and there was so little built and designed and actually out in the field so that it could be done. Everything that we did at that point was experimental.
Now, we mentioned briefly about the fact that Dolby had put out a prototype system. Basically, in 1982, Dolby introduced the Dolby Surround decoding format to the public. This would make it possible to recreate surround sound at home. A surround encoding system was sent to CBS-FOX that same year so that they could start producing VHS tapes with a surround sound mix. However, as we said, the prototype was so new that no one at Dolby had any idea how best to put it together. So he took it upon himself to put the surround sound decoder together and get the equipment up and running so that they could actually use it. In 1983, George Lucas, getting frustrated with the fact that the movie theaters were using old equipment and weren't showing his movies the way he wanted them to be seen, hired Tomlinson Holman to work on a new type of sound system certification technology, THX, partially named after its inventor, with the X standing for crossover, and as a homage to George's first movie, THX 1138. Now, THX is not a sound format. It is a sound certification process to bring sound systems up to spec so as to reproduce a theatrical experience the way a movie maker would want it to be reproduced in theaters or at home. So, with the help of Dolby Surround encoding hardware, and word getting back to George about CBS-FOX being the only home video production studio in the world at the time with the hardware they sent a THX certified technician, and he, along with my dad, worked together to get the hardware up and running and all the equipment up to spec to get Empire and Jedi encoded and surround sound, with Star Wars being redone afterwards. So, any additional details about how that conversation went?
Well, basically, I had to teach myself the surround. At first, when I got there, I didn't even know what it meant. There had only been one other film, and that was Disney's Fantasia, but that was done in 6 channels. And each of the 6 channels of that audio track was sent to different speakers. There wasn't any decoding done. It was just 6 amplifiers and 6 speakers, basically distributed through the theater. 6 systems, and it was very straightforward and easy. So that was the progenitor of surround sound. Doing it in 2 tracks meant that they were going to try and do basically what amounts to audio magic and encode all of that stuff into the 2 tracks. The hard part was, back then, everything was analog, and doing it in analog was extremely difficult. So the first decoders and encoders were a compromise, and that's why that prototype, nobody knew anything except Ray Dolby. I ended up talking to Ray Dolby about it because he was the one that came up with the idea of building this, and he had figured out the circuitry. So he told me in brief what was going on, and he told me where the adjustments were, and so I went in and started tinkering with it, and channel by channel I figured out, oh, this is what I do. And then Bob Schneider came and filled in the gaps.
Well, as you can imagine, Star Wars had at least 5 different theatrical runs between 1977 and 1982. So, obviously, there might be complications from the fact that because it had so many releases, it probably had been duped that many times for the theatrical releases. Any input about the quality that was eventually given to you at that point, considering the fact that there were that many releases before?
Yeah, the outside of that splice in the interneg, the biggest problem we ran into was the problem that everybody saw, and that was that one scene where the TIE fighter mats, where every time they added more ships, they had to add layers. And by the time it got to the end of the scene, you could see the dirt build up on the previous layers because they had spliced them together, reshot it, and then just kept adding layers until they got to the end, and there were all these TIE fighters. And it was in some points in those frames, it was hard to tell the TIE fighters from the dirt on the internet, and we just threw up our hands because we'd already heard the rumors and so forth about the number being wrong and how cruddy it looked. We just said, okay, we're going to do it, and so be it. And George decides this isn't good enough, then there was just all these question marks about that one scene, and it turned out to be basically a non-issue. He'd already made up his mind that this has got to get done, and I've got the money, and we just moved on.
Now, as you can imagine, if the TIE Fighter sequence for Episode 4 was bad, you can imagine that the asteroid sequence in Episode 5 was even worse. You want to go into how complicated that scene was?
Oh, that was a mess. Basically built the same way, and by that time we just already decided, okay, we're just going to do it the best we can and move on through. So we actually moved on through that particular scene quicker than the previous film, because actually that one was the beginning. The TIE Fighter thing was actually second because it came back. So the guys had done the TIE Fighter thing twice, and the first time it went through, there was not the big worry about we're going to do this in digital and the surround. There wasn't the attention paid to it the first time that film showed up. The second time it came through, it was like the world descended on the studio because there were audio engineers who basically came in, and they stayed, for weeks, and there was equipment everywhere because people wanted to loan us digital recorders to find out how good their stuff was compared with some other brand. And there were guys hanging around. In fact, one of them was a master acoustician named Ed Wolfram, who I really enjoyed being around because he was very vocal about the theory of acoustics and sound, and he knew a lot of what he was, he knew what he was talking about. In fact, he still does that up in Michigan, and I really stuck close with him because he had studied a lot of this, and he could answer my questions where most of the rest of the people didn't know near what he did, and just didn't know. And he hung around Fox for about 2 months. And so during that period of time, not only did I get a good education, in surround, but I got a good education on acoustics as well. And I took off and started doing other stuff with that. But it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with this film stuff, other than to say that it was a lot more complex than what we realized at first. In fact, it was more complex than what the audio world realized at first.
When Johnny was sent to CBS-FOX, I imagine that with the movie being the most recently shot, the negative would have been in the best condition. And as such, creating the dupe and such, by that time, you pretty much understood what was going on, and it was relatively straightforward and easy to get that done.
I didn't do the babysitting on 6 that I had done on the other 2. The guys knew what to do. The process had become not passe, but at least a routine. And so the setup was already in place. We had used it several times, not just with Star Wars, but several other films, because once they knew that we had the gear, then other companies, Paramount and Universal, started sending their films. We did a lot of work. Once we had done Star Wars, we did a lot of work with Warner Brothers and Universal and Paramount through that studio for those 4 years. The total number of films in 4 years that I went through was like 600 features.
Now, once the movies are done, they're duped, and they're ready to be sent to the factory. However, if CBS-FOX was the first mass production company to utilize the surround sound system and THX certification, would the factory have the same technology?
Well, hopefully there's enough time passed between the secrecy of 83, 84, 85 and today. I mean, it's what, 30, almost 40 years, at least 30 years later, because what we did in the studio, they were not able to do in the factory. We went to all this work. We had made a video master and an audio master, and they could not decode the audio master. And it was expensive. A reel of 1-inch tape back then, it was a couple $100 a reel, and we were doing multiple reels. Basically, a one hour of videotape, of course, would then take six reels of film. And so it would, for this film, it would take a couple of master reels of 1-inch tape for the video and another couple for the audio. The audio one didn't work, and we ended up in the factory. They fought with it for 2 weeks before they gave up, because they were back against the wall. They had deadlines to meet, and they finally used the backup audio tracks that we made with DBX 900s onto the audio tracks on the 1-inch machines. So it was back to analog, and the compression, because you had to get, 85 dB of dynamic range from a 55 dB limitation on 1-inch tape. So that extra 30 dB had to come from somewhere, and the DBX 900s were the best way to compress and re-expand to put on, beta and VHS. But on beta and VHS, they were doing it with what was it, Dolby AC3. I don't think the Dolby AC3 had been invented back then. So I think they used a Dolby B process on VHS and Beta until AC3 came out. Anyway, no, the digital master did not work at the factory.
Would you say then that the 6 tracks were maintained? It was just the audio quality that had to be altered?
Yes, and I verified that. I was able to verify that because I, QC all this stuff every day. I got permission at one point to take a one-off recording of my own from, and I only did one film. I didn't try to do all 3. And so one Saturday I took an expensive cassette deck with metal tape into the studio on a Saturday afternoon, and I went through and I used the masters and made a soundtrack only. I didn't try to duplicate the video at all. I was really interested in the surround, and I wanted to find out what the surround would sound like in our living room, because surround decoders at that time were running between $1,000 and $2,000-$3,000, depending on which company you bought them from. And since what we had were prototypes, obviously most companies, even the consumer stuff that was out, was very close to prototypes. So I sat down and designed a surround system for our living room and built the speakers myself, and then played back this tape in our living room to find out, what's this going to sound like in somebody's house? Because all I'd heard was in our film studios and, the ideal environment and all that stuff. So being able to hear that in our living room for the first time with this crude surround decoder that I had made out of a few chips, including the delay, really taught me what went into this process. I think we still have that tape, but as far as I know, because I was there at the studio, nobody else went in and made any copies. I made the only copy of the soundtrack of the movie, and basically for test purposes, because I wanted to hear what we were doing in a home environment to QC it.
Now, even though the movies never got a proper surround sound dupe in terms of the quality of the audio, we do have one of the original dupes made at the studio, which a copy would have been given to George Lucas. We played it on a SVHS machine that we had lying around, just plugged it into our surround system, a brand new surround system. And interestingly enough, despite the dupe being made at least 30 plus years ago, setting the Dolby Surround decoder to Pro Logic 2, the surround soundtrack was still audible in our 5.1 surround.
Yeah, it was interesting because I remember the guy in the film suite, because they would make 2 copies of each in case one of them was bad, we'd send the backup. Well, I had the backups for both. I've had the backups for every movie that I was involved in. When I got a hold of that basically when I left Fox, they gave me all of the copies of all of the films I had worked on, and we kind of sorted them out here at home and decided which ones we were going to keep and which ones we were going to recycle. And that was one that we particularly wanted to hang on to. The video wasn't that great, obviously, VHS, letterbox. It was more keeping that surround track intact, and it was amazing to have a 30-year-old VHS tape trigger our 2-year-old Sony ProLogic receiver, and it immediately came on, detected it, and sent the surround out. And here we are sitting listening to this movie with all of the surround information, and it was like being back in the film suite again, working on this. I was just flabbergasted that this thing had actually lasted through all of that time, and there was, because it was done digitally in our copies, we didn't have to worry about that, what was going on at the factory. That copy was digital, and it showed up with everything.
Now, to everyone who says that they have a copy of Star Wars on a particular media format, yes, I'm sure it was transferred to that format. However, it was probably before or after my dad's tenure at the company. He was tasked only with the transferring of the movies to VHS and Beta. The CED was released in 1982 before he was hired, and the Laserdisc was released in 1986 before my dad had left. But he could give some insight about what could arise in terms of transferring to those mediums. Any comments about how hard it would have been to do CED?
Now, everything that had been done before I started there would have been done in analog. They didn't have any digital gear in the broadcast world at that point. Any digital. Basically, all of that is error corrected. So when it's done on Blu-ray, you get the same level that they've had generated in the film studio, because it's all error corrected until it gets to your house, and whatever 4 or 5 steps that have gone in time from that point to you watching it on, a HD TV or 4K TV. It's all there the way it was in the studio. None of that existed. You couldn't deliver what we were seeing on a monitor in the film studio to home. It just wasn't possible. Every time you duplicated, every time you took that master and you made a copy and then you used that copy for something else, every time you put the tape on the machine, it would degrade just a tiny bit. That's the world of analog. And you can say all you want about how analog recording is this and that and the other thing, but the point is that it wears, and there is no way to correct for it. So the laser, the CED, being an analog, are going to suffer from all of the analog chain.
Any comments about how you would do Laserdisc?
We had a Laserdisc recorder in the studio. One guy wanted to make laser masters of instructional videos that he was doing. So he brought one in, and he brought the big platters in. They were glass with the substrate in them. And so I was really curious about it, and I spent a week working with him doing that. I wasn't too impressed. The quality of recording on the Laserdisc was only slightly better than Betamax. And the Betamax that we had at that point was definitely better than VHS. We could see that in both. We were getting Sony machines, so both the VHS and the Beta were coming from the same company. So it wasn't like they were cheaping out on one so that the other would look better. VHS won out. Anyway. But the laser didn't look a whole lot better than the tape, and it was a lot more expensive. One platter was $1,200. So the format itself, unless you were wealthy, just simply wasn't worth having at home. And the player was roughly 10 inches tall, almost 24 inches deep, and about 14 inches wide. It was huge. And it would create a lot of heat, too. So you'd have to have a lot of air conditioning and huge, deep pockets to afford, the masters or copies or whatever you want to get of these laser discs that were distributed. I understand that they did get them, the price down for, the playback only, but my goodness, that it pretty much died because of the expense compared to, tape. And of course now with Blu-ray, there's, that's just pennies on the dollar compared to what these 12-inch platters, and they were very fragile, glass. So if something happened and they cracked, they were gone. You're done. There was no integral strength to them.
Okay, well then would you say that Laserdisc would be a collector's medium as opposed to VHS being a consumer medium?
Definitely collector's medium because, number one, they were more expensive. Number two, they were more fragile. Number three, they would last longer because if you could keep them from getting damaged, they would basically last forever. Unlike the VHS and betas, which are going to degrade just sitting. The recordings on a laser are basically phase change recordings on a substrate, and they aren't going to go away.
I have heard stuff about laser rot. That was a problem for, like, it was either early Laserdisc presses or when...
Well, the CDs had the same problem early on. In fact, we've got one that only lasted about 2 years, and the same thing happened to it. They'd gotten a bad batch, and they didn't offer to replace any of it for anybody. It just said, oh, this particular batch out of this factory had this problem, and sure enough, we got one.
But for all intents and purposes, a properly made Laserdisc could last almost as long as CDs.
Longer. They were glass. CDs are plastic.
After the Trilogy, sometime in 1987, CBS-FOX was losing money because of Blockbuster. At this point, my dad ended up getting laid off because of the money. Eventually, it was sold off to Steve Wild to become Grayson Wild Studios. The company started to dramatically lose money after that. Mind you, at the same time, Fox had lost the licensing for a number of movies, so it split up into Fox Entertainment and CBS Entertainment. And then Fox just started doing their own home media formats after that. How has surround sound technology evolved over the past 30 years?
It's interesting. The same formula that the AES came up with for surround in the beginning still is being used. It's still the structure of surround today, you know, with all the permutations that different companies try to put into it, that, you know, they try to duplicate 4-track, you know, with its quadraphonic sound, or, you know, the discrete 6-track that, you know, some movies come out with. You know, the bottom line is, outside of the digital advantages of steering signals, it didn't change a whole lot. 7.1 is basically 5.1 with more speakers. Now, they do have decoding techniques where they say they can peel off sounds to different speakers, but I've listened to them, and I really can't tell a significant, there may be a difference, but I can't tell a significant difference between the 5.1 or 6.1 that we have and the 7.1 that Sony now sells for home theaters.
And so now we come to the movies being released on DVD and Blu-ray. Thought about this, about how best to approach this, and the way I see it, we're not going to talk about the special edition, what extra stuff was added, so much as what color changes were done to make the film look more consistent in terms of what certain colors were supposed to look like when it was originally done, but couldn't be properly adjusted at the time because of limitations. Now, for episode 4, the Blu-ray release, the entire film looks noisy.
Yep, I saw that. It looked like they had done a really rushed job of that new transfer. It's obvious that the edges are clearer than they were in the original because we were working with much lower resolution. But there's just crawly noise throughout the film in that newer transfer. I don't know what happened. I don't know what they did, if they were rushed, if they had, you know, substandard equipment. That's hard to believe because basically all of these studios are using the same film transfer machines and recorders with updates. You know, they had digital, we had analog. So I don't know what they did that caused that, because it looks like fixed pattern noise in broadcast cameras, and, except that it's over most of the film, and I can't account for it. It's just disgusting looking. The color changes that I saw compared to what we did definitely look like somebody didn't pay attention, because even from scene to scene there are color shifts both in hue and saturation that George would never have approved when we did the first three films, episodes 4, 5, and 6. But, you know, I wasn't there, and it didn't go to Fox, or it didn't go to Grayson Wild. It went to, you know, another studio. So, you know, it's, for me, it has to be water on the bridge. At some point, you got to walk away and say, okay, I'm willing to accept this, or I'm not going to accept it, and you just say, okay, that's a different world, and, you know, I leave it. But doing those films was the highlight of my career, so yeah, I follow it if I get a chance to, and I'm not pleased with what I saw.
And the color variation he was referring to is basically where we saw intense gamma variations from shot to shot. Now, to add to that, we're watching this on a brand new Sony 4K 3D TV, of which we had not made any changes to the color. It is factory default, and Sony prides herself on making their TVs in such a way that you don't have to modify them all that much to get proper color corrections. And my dad, in fact, checked the later movies that had less noise, and they look exactly like what he saw at CBS-FOX. So this TV is properly tuned to what the colors should look like. So whatever we saw is a result of what was done to the Blu-ray.
Yeah, basically, this model here is an 850, and it's a 55-inch. Basically, getting the minimum size that 4K can resolve to. So, you know, you can get smaller TVs with 4K, but it's interpolating between pixels if you do, just like HD is interpolating on a 37-inch or smaller television. That's a basic standard that Tektronix set years ago, that a native size for broadcast media at HD is 37 inches, and so on and so forth. If you get 8K, then it's even bigger. But Sony has done, in fact, I use Sony OLED monitors at work, and this 850 compares very well with them. The actual film that we looked at on it, it was amazing how closely episode 5 and 6 were to what we actually saw on the Barco color monitor in the film suite back in 1983 and 84.
People have wondered whether or not the snow scenes look bluer than usual, which probably just relates to the fact that the VHS or Laserdisc copies that were sent out were probably copies made more and more later on from the original, to the point where they probably might not have looked as vivid as they originally did.
Yeah, the snow scenes that we were doing in the studio, we actually intentionally went slightly blue to give a cold feeling. When you look at snow in daylight outside your home, if you live up north, you see that white. Your eyes will accustom themselves to the color of that snow, and you will call it white. But it is only white to your eyes because of the color temperature of the sun and the fact that your eyes are conditioned. The color temperature of the sun is a 5600 Kelvin. But in a studio, the lights that are in a studio can vary from 3200 Kelvin to 7700 Kelvin. And there isn't a TV made that covers that gamut of color. So you pick one color and you look at your movie and say, I like it or I don't like it.
So for all intents and purposes, the snow scenes on the Blu-ray edition are not any bluer than they would have looked in the studio at CBS-FOX back then.
Exactly. They look the same as when I was sitting in the film suite.
Now, one other thing people have noticed was that R2-D2's blue panels look different from scene to scene. Now, take into consideration that the film would have been shot at many different locations, probably using many different cameras. There's the studio inside Leavesden. There is the backlot at Leavesden. Then there was Norway and blue screen effect. Now, R2, his scenes were all done either in the studio or on the backlot or in front of a blue screen. Now, for the ones that were shot in the studio and the backlot, that would have been easy to maintain consistent colors throughout the shot. Now, for all intents and purposes, as far as the blue screen goes, basically, blue was the lesser of two evils. They had the option of blue screen or green screen. Green, because it contains skin tones, that would have messed up a whole lot of other colors in the scene. Whereas if you use blue, it's only going to mess up the blue colors, which would have been R2. So if he looked black in those scenes, it was because they withdrew the blue color. As such, they recolored his panels in the Blu-ray so that it would look blue again. Now, certain shots of R2 obviously look like they had a lot more blue intensity than they should have had, which is obviously just some miscoloring or something. But for artistic purposes, it doesn't look too bad.
Well, yeah, the nature of doing blue screen and green screen is so that you can replace the background. Well, in doing that, if you don't separate the colors of your foreground video from what you're using as your screen, then there are things that are going to either disappear or change color, and that's just the nature of the medium. And that's exactly what happened to those plates on R2's casing, is that they lost their color because that's what happens to a blue screen. Too bad.
So for those of you who don't like it just because it doesn't look like the original, whatever. Otherwise, it's nice to see them doing this little nuance to bring a little color back to this one scene that got removed in the first place due to a filming technicality. Now, the asteroid field, you had mentioned that it was a complete mess before due to the fact that they were doing layered optical work on top of layered optical work to where it could have been like 10 layers worth of optical printing.
Oh, goodness, yeah, that maybe more. I mean, it looked like there were hundreds of rocks, flying past that Millennium Falcon. I don't know how they made it look as good as they did, considering the era that they were doing this work in. There weren't a whole lot of choices, i.e. computers. And computers didn't exist that could handle those kinds of resolutions and that kind of volume of file storage. So you shoot and then edit.
And of course, with the Blu-ray release, they were able to recover every single one of the optical elements that was done at ILM and recompiled them so that the print looked much cleaner than it originally did. How do you think that looked?
I thought it looked really nice. I was surprised and pleased, for having done the original work on those film transfers. It felt like, okay, I can enjoy this. I can put aside, the technical stuff a bit and just enjoy the story and plot because it looks nice. It sounds good. This is fun.
Now, keep in mind, this is coming from someone who, a part of their mind will notice the technical flaws that are going on with a particular scene.
Always.
So for them to be able to enjoy the sequence without looking at the fact that there was so many technical problems going on, that is impressive. Another thing that was pointed out was whether or not Dagobah looked greener for the Blu-ray release than past releases.
No, when it really did look like what we had color corrected in the studio. I didn't see any excessive green in any of those scenes.
Other than like maybe the vegetation.
Well, yeah, the vegetation, is going to look earth tones, green and brown anyway. But Luke's uniform, his face, his hair, anything that would look green, it would be because of something else reflecting on it. Some object that had reflectivity and showing up on his face. But no, there wasn't. I didn't see any actual intentional shading that made things look green. No.
Yeah, basically the skin tones and whatever clothing was in the scene didn't look green, and as such, that points out the fact that it wasn't greener. And you make note about the fact that the orange in the jumpsuit looked less saturated?
Yep. That looked really pale compared to what I remember in the studio. That orange a lot more vivid. That was really disappointing.
So, yeah, there might have been some color alteration for the Blu-ray. We don't actually have that information in particular, but that's one of those things where it's a minor thing that we're not exactly sure what happened for this Blu-ray release. Now, the special edition add-on I will mention is that in Cloud City, originally, the set had a rather claustrophobic feel due to the fact that they were basically these hallways with walls all over. Whereas, for the special edition, something that Irvin Kershner, the director of Empire, and George Lucas wanted to do was make the city feel more open by adding windows, sort of like show the outside of Cloud City. One thing that would have had to have been done was, if you're looking out a window, there's going to be a halo effect around objects inside the building.
Yeah, I saw that on Billy Williams' head. I thought that halo effect got too intrusive, but that was their choice, and they did it, and people have to live with the results of that.
And the last thing would be Episode 6, what fans have dubbed the Emperor's Slugs.
Oh, goodness. When I first heard that term, I thought, what in the world are they talking about? And then when you showed it to me, oh, duh. It's most likely that someone retouched those frames with a brush and ink, opaque ink, to cover up pinholes that were in the emulsion. And it's something that goes on in the print industry with negatives that are made for offset presses constantly. It's impossible to have a completely correct negative. They're around 8.5 by 11, with margins and so forth. And for a page to not have pinholes in that negative is almost impossible. I've never seen one. So the negatives are made by a photographic process, and then a person goes over that negative with a brush and dips it into ink and then covers every pinhole. And that's exactly what that slug looks like, is that somebody took a brush and covered over a hole in the emulsion.
So the fact that they were able to go back and touch up that so the slugs look more like the surrounding material or the face of the Emperor, sort of like brings back even that little minor detail as being fixed up.
Yeah. Yeah, but think of what it would have looked like without retouching it.
Yeah. Now, some particular scenes in these trilogies that definitely would have benefited from restoration effort. For example, the Luke Vader duel on Dagobah. If anyone compares their Laserdisc to the Blu-ray, they'll see a lot of dirt on the Laserdisc, whereas a lot of that dirt was removed for the Blu-ray release. So restoration has benefited the Star Wars trilogy quite a bit. Now, looking at the Blu-rays overall, putting aside the fact that there was all that noise in episode 4, what's your opinion on how good these movies look having been released on the Blu-ray format?
They're considerably improved. Even the one that has all the noise in it, which to me looks like fixed pattern noise, because the increased resolution, it still looks better outside of the noise issue. Overall, there is more detail. The chroma is more saturated than was even possible back in 83 and 84. So the stuff that has come out on Blu-ray has really caused me to take a new interest in Star Wars as a viewable series for me, totally outside of the engineering that I had to do on the first 3 films. I enjoy keeping up with it. I'm not the avid collector. I just like watching what they're doing with CGI and the action scenes and stuff, because the whole theme of Star Wars and that storyline are fun. But definitely, the new stuff looks better.
Now, aside from the fact that the films were shot on 35mm, and they would more than likely benefit from a 4K transfer due to the fact that 35mm is, would you say for all intents and purposes, 5K?
Yeah, their opinions go back and forth, but basically, when you sample a 35mm analog image, which is the negative on a film frame, it runs down after about 5,000 pixels per inch, 5K. It just becomes superfluous and overdone, but you get much more detailed the more that you sample a film from. It's amazing how good the lenses and films were starting in even the silent era. When you do a digital reconstruction of that film in 4K, it's amazing how good they continue to look. And to shoot and sample in 4K, even 5 and 6K of those films, they are still holding up. So to equate a 35mm, it's somewhere between 4 and 5K. Yes.
So the Blu-ray release would be, for all intents and purposes, the closest thing to how it originally looked at CBS-FOX video at the time. Let me rephrase that question. So the Blu-ray release would be equatable to how good it looked at CBS-FOX at the time you saw the original film elements, as to something that released today is as good as it could possibly look until a future format is released.
Well, these ones that are done in Blu-ray look better than what we could see on our CRTs at the film studio. There's an obvious improvement. The HD that they're capable of, and I haven't seen any in 4K yet. The HD looks significantly better than what we could see in the studio. The resolution is much better. The TVs back then simply weren't capable of that, and the films, we scanned them back then with basically whatever the technology was the best of, and then in the broadcast world, we'd spend millions of dollars getting the absolute best gear, so that what we generated for the public started out up here, even though we knew that the degeneration that was going to happen between what we did in the studio and then duplicated for the factory, and then what the factory did for the public, and then what some store chain may have done. There could be 3 steps, and in that analog world, those 3 steps were definite generation losses. Well, it got better in the digital world, but now with HD and 4K, we are actually seeing every mistake that a film transfer makes, which is making it real easy for people to spot the screw-ups, which weren't quite as visible back in that NTSC era when everything was analog and now looks really smudged and ugly to us because nothing was consistent back then. Now, what I'm seeing outside of the screw-ups of a film transfer technician, and they're not always intentional. Sometimes somebody says, you're on the clock and you've got so much time, get this done. And they do what they can. So it's not always, it's not always their fault. Sometimes it's just the dollars and cents involved in get this film out the door. But the detail is remarkably better. It's actually enjoyable now. I look at a still frame from my camera compared to what I'm seeing on this TV, and it's like, ooh, that's pretty.
To finish up, one detail I will make note of is something that I compared to Laserdisc copy I found compared to the Blu-ray. For those who know about the indoor sequence, there are what are called the missing TIE fighters, which for an eagle-eye viewer, you just have to freeze frame it at just the right moment when the Falcon is flying through the ties and going upward. You will see a couple of blank spots underneath the Falcon where some TIE fighters would have been added, but for some reason ILM didn't add them. That is very evident on the Laserdisc if you can freeze frame it at just the right moment. But for the Blu-ray, they removed them. And there you have it. A little insight into what took place during the CBS-FOX era to get Star Wars to home entertainment systems. Obviously, a lot of the technical process is just a matter of learning how to get a film transfer system working so as to mass-produce a movie for distribution to home audiences. However, the fact that they were the only company in the country at the time to have a surround sound encoding system was significant. Furthermore, knowing how the movies should look before the special edition and how similar the Blu-ray is to the original should give future fan editors some insight into how the movie should look should they decide to go back and adjust the changes they've made based on a supervisor who saw the interpositives of all three movies.